Hi there, welcome to Raising Change Globally. I have my tea because this is my very first attempt at creating a YouTube channel and tea calms my nerves. I'm Angela. I lived overseas for 30 years across 11 different countries. I raised 2 children on the expat trail. I'm now repatriated, been through an excruciatingly stressful expat divorce and a cancer diagnosis, and I am here to talk about it all. One of the things that expat life has taught me is this: you don't always arrive knowing exactly what you're doing or who you will become by doing it. And this channel is a little bit like that too. It's definitely a work in progress. And even though I've been doing reels on Instagram for quite some time, YouTube feels like a beast to me. I mean, reels are what, 90 seconds? And some YouTubers are going on for hours, but I won't be talking for hours on YouTube, I promise you. So as an expat, one of the first things we ask when we meet another expat is, where have you been? Not to compete or to show off or anything like that, but to see if we've crossed over anywhere, or maybe we know some of the same people, because whether we like it or not, Disney was right. It is a small world after all, and I can definitely vouch for that. It's also, by asking, where have you been? It's also the fastest way to connect, because even if we've never met before, even if we're like ships that pass in the night in these locations, we often share common experiences, and that feels comforting. So with that in mind, in this very first video, I'm simply going to share with you where I've been, and maybe, just maybe, you'll find a connection there somewhere. So I'm originally from the UK, Liverpool in the north of England to be exact, which some of you may know as Beetle City. That's where the Beatles are from. Or you might know it because of football. I'm not going to tell you which football team I support just yet because I don't want to upset anyone. Anyway, I didn't have the best childhood, and my 2 older sisters left the UK as soon as they left school at 16. So when I turned 17, I moved to Germany to live with my sister. We were in a town called Hanau, just outside Frankfurt. And it was basically a US military town. My mother had lived there before I got there, and she ended up marrying a US soldier, and they moved to the States. So a couple of years later, I went to live with them, which meant I was living with my mother for the first time since I was 7 years old. But that is another story for another day. After about 2 years of living in Jacksonville, Florida, we moved again, this time to South Korea. I lived on Yongsan military base in Seoul, which was an incredible experience. And without knowing it at that time, it marked the beginning of many years in Asia for me. But before I went back to Asia, my stepfamily moved back to the US, and I wanted to keep traveling and not go backwards. So I headed to Caracas, Venezuela, to visit my eldest sister, who had moved there after marrying her Venezuelan husband quite a few years before. Venezuela was one of the most beautiful countries I had ever seen, but unfortunately, while I was there, it was during 2 coups. So the 3 years that I spent there were a little scary, to say the least. And that's where I met my Italian husband, who worked in the hotel business. We got married in Rhode Island because it was the easiest place to gather friends and family. And then we headed off to Taiwan. This was when traveling for adventure as a single woman ended and traveling for business began. And it was also the very first time I had ever heard the term expat or trailing spouse used to describe me. After a couple of years in Taipei, we moved to New Delhi in India, which was an absolute feast for the senses. And after a couple of years there, on the very day we left, I found out that I was pregnant with our first child. Luckily, we were headed to KL, Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, which was a wonderful place. I fell in love with KL immediately, and it was a really great place to have your first baby. So if you've lived in Malaysia, you'll know exactly what I mean when I say you can even book the Dato suite when you give birth. That's a bit of an inside joke for our Malaysia expats. Even though we arrived during a major economic crisis in Malaysia, the country was vibrant and culturally diverse, and the expat community was very well established. Unfortunately, even before the baby was born, my husband took a job in Vietnam. So that time around, we were in Malaysia for less than a year. Vietnam was an incredible experience, but with a brand new baby, it wasn't easy. I have so many stories to share there, but again, that's for another day. We were about 2 years in Vietnam and eventually headed back to Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. And that time we stayed for about 3 years and we had our second child. And unbelievably, I gave birth in the same hospital with the same doctor and even the same anesthesiologist, which is unheard of in the expat world. Leaving KL that time was so hard for me, not just because the boys and I had found our rhythm there and our friends, but because we didn't know where we were going next. We returned to Europe for a few months in absolute limbo while my husband looked for his next career opportunity, which turned out to be the complete opposite side of the world. In fact, when my dad heard where we were going, he said, "This time you're going so far away that if you keep going, you'll be on your way back." And he wasn't wrong. We were off to Moorea in French Polynesia. It was this tiny little island that you can drive around in just over an hour. The boys were 3 and 5 when we arrived in Tahiti, and after so many moves and uncertainties, I made the decision to homeschool them. And honestly, it was the best decision I had ever made. It was also the most beautiful playground for them to explore at that age. We stayed there for about 3 years before heading back to, can you guess, Malaysia for the third time. We lived on Langkawi for about a year, and then the boys and I moved to KL so that they could go to school, and my husband continued to work in Langkawi. We bought an apartment in Malaysia, and for the first time, we started to feel somewhat settled. Now, I can't remember if it was 3 or 4 years or somewhere in between that we were in Malaysia that time. I'll have to check. But when we did leave, it was the first time that I cried in the back of the car on the way to the airport with a child on either side of me, wondering if our life would ever be normal, whatever normal is. I always knew that this life was an incredible education, but I also knew deep down that children need stability and a sense of belonging. And this wasn't it. But as expats, we keep calm and carry on. So by the time we arrived in our new home in Amman, Jordan, we were already focusing on the positives and just hoping that the transition would go smoothly. And smoothly was an understatement. The transition went really well for the boys, but for me, Jordan absolutely changed my life in ways that I never expected, and on so many levels. And I'll definitely be sharing more about that as this channel grows. We stayed in Jordan for about 3 years, and I definitely could have stayed longer there, but I knew that the boys needed something more stable, especially as they approached high school. And we didn't have a plan for stability. We were just basically floating around the world and going wherever the hotel business told us to go. There were definitely other factors at play too, but eventually I made the incredibly difficult decision to leave behind the expat world, and the boys and I moved back to the UK. For years, I'd heard expats talk about how hard repatriation is, and honestly, they were not kidding. I was in denial, to be honest, until I got here and experienced it myself. It was the hardest move of my life, which is why I now include the UK in my list of countries that I've lived in, because in many ways, the UK felt more foreign to me than anywhere else I'd ever been. But there is good news. After 13 years of being back here, moving to the UK was the best decision for the boys. As you can imagine, I have a million stories to tell and plenty of opinions to share about the expat life. But this video is way longer than I ever thought it would be. I haven't drank my tea yet, so I'll just leave you with the geography for now. One last thing before I go. The most common question I get after listing the countries I've lived in is this: which one was your favorite? And I have to say, and I always do, that is a very difficult question to answer. Almost impossible, because every country has its ups and downs and its pros and cons. But I will say my heart is still in Jordan. So if any part of my story sounds familiar to you or stirs something up of your own, then you're probably in the right place. This channel is going to be about the emotional reality of expat life, and that includes identity and belonging and parenting on the expat trail, and what it really means to feel at home in yourself wherever you are in the world. I'm so glad you found your way here, and I really hope you stick around. So do the thing that the YouTubers tell you to do at the end. Click subscribe and like and all those things, and I'll figure out an ending in the next video. Cheers.